I'm Demetria Kalodimos, and you're listening to Banner and Company, a production of the new Nashville Banner. Now, if you've been around, you may pick up on something, our name. It's a nod to my old partner in crime, Dan Miller. He is and always will be my gold standard.
Good evening, welcome. Good program for you tonight. Our guest is Jimmy Buffett, one of the most consistently appealing writers and performers in the music business today.
There are a lot of reasons why people loved Dan's show, Miller and Company. It aired on Sunday nights, late, after the news, when there was literally nothing else to watch. You couldn't play a tape or a DVD. There was no Netflix, folks.
It was one of those really not very pleasant times in my life, and I was leaving Nashville, breaking up with my wife, moved to Florida, supposedly to have a job which wasn't there. So I just extended from Miami and went down to Key West, and it was November, and it was 85 degrees, and I said, this is it for Jimmy Buffett for a while.
Who lives on an island? What type people do you find around?
Any island, I think, Dan, you have to be of a certain mentality.
It wasn't an interview show. I wouldn't call it that. It was more of a conversation. And that's really because Dan Miller was especially good at listening like the everyman. If somebody used a big word or something needed explaining, he knew how to ask without shame and without apologizing. It's that conversation that I think we need more of, maybe now more than ever. So that's what we're going to do. Each week, we'll invite a new guest into our living room, which really we hope will be your living room, as you sit back and join the conversation with us. We'll slow down just enough to give you a breather and introduce you to something and someone in our city that you hadn't quite thought of before, or at least not in this way. Well-known Nashvillians, lesser known, and everyone in between. There is no one we won't talk to. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but really, think about the times you've gotten a chance to know someone new or connect with a distant acquaintance without interruption. Have you ever regretted that? You're our company, so pull up a chair and join us. So it will go without saying for some of you that the Nashville Banner has been around for a long time. It was long our city's afternoon newspaper to the Tennesseans' morning paper. Now, the Banner shut down in the 90s, and let's just say a lot has happened to Nashville's local media scene since. Now the Nashville Banner is back, and we hit the ground running in March. We've got reporters on courts, metro government, and criminal justice. And yes, we're a far cry from print, but better yet, we've got something for every platform. Video, audio. Hell, they may even make me get on TikTok. But we don't want to get too far along without looking back at our history, and trust us, it is worth looking back.
Dad said that there was one editorial that was mentioned about African Americans being descendants of monkeys.
You know, the police really did take great pleasure in trying to horrify me.
They presented me the phone that at that moment I kicked across the Capitol Hill press room, and it just fell into a million pieces. And they collected.
November the 22nd, 1963, and this paper had 42 pages, and the price was 10 cents. President Kennedy murdered in Texas. This is an extra. Killer's gun also fails Governor Conley.
Parker Toler still has copies of the old Nashville Banner, a bunch of them. And that's not just because he was a news junkie. In fact, he wouldn't necessarily call himself that, even though he still takes the paper today, has since 1954, the year he became a paperboy. His route was on 15th Avenue, along Belmont Boulevard, Compton, and Bernard.
It had those tremendous hills, and I was 15 years old at the time I started that route, and so I did not have a car, so I'd have to get one of the folks that did have a car to spot those papers for me so I could get them delivered.
He carried the Banner and the Tennessean before and after school.
I would make between $400 and $500 a month. That was more money than a lot of people working were making. That was a tremendous amount of money.
It was hard work. And you know what? Parker was good at it.
There's a little bit of an art to doing it. It was demanded that you put the paper on the porch. You couldn't just throw it in the yard. So you got some skill at how you roll those papers and how you threw them.
His hands would turn black from the ink rolling those papers.
I would use rubber bands mainly on Sunday because you couldn't roll any Sunday paper. They were tremendous.
And if it was raining, he'd wrap them in wax paper.
So you'd have to pull all your papers aside because everybody was in there. It was kind of a free-for-all every morning. But we had to have a manager there that kind of watched a little bit, but half the time he was about half asleep. So you had to get all your papers. So when I get my papers, we'd have a bench. I'd get my papers over there and get them laid out. First thing I'd do is pull out the newspaper and see what the headlines were, and I would read most of the front page of the paper to see what was happening in our city.
These days, it's hard to imagine what it was like to have two robust local newspapers every day, even for those of us who were around when it was happening.
When you had two different news cycles, the morning paper and the afternoon paper, then if we missed something in the morning, or even if we didn't, we would have to take another approach to it for our story in the afternoon. So the readers were always going to get two different versions, or at least an updated version, or somebody questioning the first version or something, because it was impossible to just have one story stand and then move on to something else.
That's Mary Hance. She started at the Banner in January 1976 as a lowly copy clerk. Her words, not mine. But she'd go on to become a bit of a trailblazer.
As the first woman police reporter, it was kind of a challenge because the police really did take great pleasure in trying to horrify me.
But her claim to fame is when she decided to grab onto the title Miss Cheap.
Whose idea was that?
It was my idea.
Great.
It was my idea. It was one of those things that...
She was on the business desk at the time and found that her stories on bargains had broad appeal. And you know what? I get that.
Whether you're rich or poor, men or women, that everybody likes to think they got more than their money's worth. So I proposed it, and, at first people didn't like the name. They said it was, that cheap was derogatory, but... I wanted it to be fun. I didn't want it to be, 20 things to do with your old pantyhose. I mean, I wanted it to be something that real people could do and have fun with and, not really.
Now let me paint a picture of the old Nashville Banner for you. In the late 70s, the Banner had 110 employees. There were times when the daily paper would go to print with up to 64 pages. In the late 80s and early 90s, there were people writing about recipes and food, an arts reporter, several people on the music beat. There was even a dedicated television writer, Greg Bailey. His whole job was to write about TV. And he was tough, once roasted me for an especially bad election night fumble. That still stings, Greg. Then there was a society reporter. Her name was Betty Banner.
Betty had lots of nicknames. Betty was BB. Betty was Bettams. Betty was Betts.
KOS became Betty Banner in the late 80s, but she was far from the first.
I mean, it goes decades back. And it was a succession of women who took on the role of Betty Banner. Betty was supposed to be anonymous, like no one knew who Betty Banner was. And that was partially because there were so many different Bettys through the years. And also many of the society women that were written about had been Bettys. But Betty was always spoken about in the third person. So I would get a call that would say, can Betty come to our luncheon or our party or our kickoff or our whatever? You know, I had moved to Nashville from New York City. I had no concept of Southern society or any of that. It was all pretty alien to me. And, you know, within the paper itself, Betty wasn't exactly the most highly regarded. And it was definitely not highly regarded among the photographers who would rather be, you know, covering a fire than going to a tea or going to the Swan Ball. Betty was a little bit, I'm not going to say ditzy, but, you know, it wasn't a super serious subject that she was covering. Betty had fun. Betty was maybe a little bit flighty sometimes. I like to say that Betty would never get drunk, but she might get a little tipsy. Betty would flirt, but she would never make an advance or do anything inappropriate. Betty was friendly, but not overly so.
Doesn't that sound like the perfect Southern belle? Well, Kay West nailed the tone with her own voice mixed in here and there.
I am proud to say that I was the last. I wasn't the first Betty, but I was the last Betty.
In February 1998, the Banner shut down. But before we get to that, there's a lot more to unravel from the Banner's wild and, at times, troubling history. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. You're listening to Banner & Company. Back when Nashville was a two-paper town, competition was fierce, and change, in many ways, was slow in coming. We've been hearing from some of the women who made names for themselves at the Banner from the 70s on. A few held leadership roles, and most we spoke to looked back kindly on those years at 1100 Broadway. But it wasn't exactly a diverse environment from the jump. In fact, if we're going way, way back, the Banner was firmly against women's suffrage in the 20s. And in the 1950s, the Banner and its publisher were overtly opposed to integrating Nashville schools. That publisher was James Stallman, a man Robert Churchwell Jr. never met personally.
Well, from what I'd heard, he was an interesting person. He didn't care for African Americans much at all. He did not want Nashville to be integrated. And the Banner reflected that in their editorials. I think Dad said that there was one editorial that was mentioned about African Americans being descendants of monkeys. And he said they used the N-word quite a bit in print.
His dad is Robert Churchwell. And if you don't know that name already, you're gonna.
My dad was a reporter at the Banner, was the first African-American hired to produce news for the Banner. And they called him the Jackie Robinson of journalism.
Because he was the first. He came to the Banner in 1950. And as for why?
Well, because he was convinced to work for the Banner. I mean, they're the one that came to him. He didn't go to them. They came to him.
Which may sound odd, given that the publisher was overtly racist.
But they realized, because of economics, that they needed the African-American community's money. So they felt the best way to do that, was very smart on their part, is to get an African-American reporter to come in and do stories just for the African-American community.
Stallman's questionable business motivations aside, what Churchwell made of that job and what it meant to the community was extraordinary. He brought a light with his stories. He told stories of success and celebration within Nashville's black communities. They were revolutionary because they were ordinary and broke the Banner's pattern of solely portraying black Nashvillians as criminals.
He covered everything. He covered from babies being born to educational stories, covered churches, he covered elementary school, junior high school, college. Whatever took place in the African American community, he covered. Dad had to get up early morning, and at that time he didn't have a car. And so he would walk around Black Nashville gathering his stories. And so he would get his stories. His deadline was, I think, 10 o'clock, because Banner being the evening daily, he had to get his stories into the editor before it could be published. So it took a lot of fortitude to do that, a lot of discipline to do that, a lot of stick-to-itness to do that. And he never missed a deadline. He never missed a deadline. He always made his deadline. He believed that what he was doing was worthwhile, something that would take upon greater than he ever thought. And so, with that type of discipline, that type of mindset, that type of faith, because it takes faith to go up against opposition, and of course, quite a bit of opposition. But he, with that, and as with God, all things are possible, and he took care of what he needed to take care of.
Robert Churchwell was not given a desk for his first 5 years as a full-time reporter. He'd go into the newsroom only to turn in his story to the city editor. He ended up getting a desk of his own after 2 colleagues protested. He didn't get to attend staff meetings. He wasn't invited to the staff Christmas parties. And his pay was not even close to his white counterparts, something like $38 a week. For reference, Parker Toler, the teenage paperboy working around that same time, well, he says he was making $400 to $500 a month for delivering the paper. That'd be more than double what Churchwell made making the paper. So Churchwell had to work a second job at Fisk University to provide for his family of 6.
But when he came home, he was dad. He was dad. None of the pressures that he had showed with us. So I guess you say, as it's in Star Wars, the Force is strong with this one, okay?
Robert Churchwell was the only black reporter at the Banner for decades.
So from, 4 or 5 years old, I knew I wanted to be in news. I knew I wanted to work for the Banner. My dad would bring the final edition home every day, so that's how I learned how to spell Banner, actually, and final and edition. But, so I knew that's what I wanted to do. God put that inside of me as a little girl.
That's Tam Gordon. She started applying to work for the Banner in 1974. And she kept going, kept going.
I kept going till the security guard felt sorry for me one day. He said, "Why don't you go over next door? Why don't you go over next door?"
Next door to the competition, the Tennesseans.
I said, no, this is where I have to work.
Finally, after 4 years of trying, legendary reporter Larry Brinton, who had been on the job only 3 days, hired Tam. She became the first black woman to work in the Banner newsroom. Going in, she had no experience, so she started as an editorial assistant, doing dictation and obits. She just wanted to get her foot in the newsroom door. Then, one day, a small plane went down in a backyard in Donaldson, and no one was there to cover it but Tam. Pretty soon, she got the federal court beat.
And despite what the bosses said that nobody stays on a beat any longer than a year or 2, I was there for 9 years. So.
Is it exciting to see your name printed on the page by Tam Gordon?
You know what? Heck yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. It was. My mother would keep, from the day I went and had my first byline, she would like clip all these stories, clip these stories. And then she's like, I guess they're going to keep you. So she just kind of quit clipping.
Robert Churchwell retired not too long after Tam started. At least by then, there were a few more women on staff. Mary Hance, who we heard from earlier, and Elise McMillan was hired as a GA reporter. But the Banner was kind of a boys' club.
Yeah, so my name is Bruce Dobie, and I went to work at the Nashville Banner in 1983.
He was fresh out of journalism school at Columbia in New York City. He claims his professors told him he'd never cut it as a journalist in the big city, to head back down south. He came to interview at the Tennessean, but that didn't pan out.
And I was running low on cash. This is now like I graduated in May, and it was now October. I'm like, I got to get a job. And I sent a resume to the Banner. And it was one of the more phenomenal interviews I've ever had.
First, he met with managing editor Joe Worley. Then Worley passed him off to the city editor, Bill Hance.
And so Hance comes in and interviews me, and he says, oh my God, I'm looking at your resume. You went to Sewanee. He said, my wife went to Sewanee. I said, yeah. And he goes, can I call a professor there and ask him about you? And I said, yeah, sure. He said, I'm going to call a guy named Bill Clarkson, who's in the English department. I said, you call him up. He taught me modern American poetry and modern American short fiction. So he calls. He said, I'm going to ask him if you can write. And so he gets Clarkson on the phone, and he's sitting across from me, and I've got my little, blazer on, tie, and all that. And he's like, Clarkson, I'm here with Bruce Dobie. Can he hold his liquor? And Hance listens to the response. He goes, that's all I need to know. And he hung up the phone, and I guess the answer was yes. And he said, how's $250 a week? And I said, I will come to work Monday morning. And I went to work Monday morning. Had nothing to do with American journalism. It had to do with the quantity of beer you could accommodate into your physique. So, yeah.
He started off working the night metro shift, 2 to midnight.
And invariably, I would leave there and just go to the Gold Rush. It was the only place open in town. And I'd eat a bean roll and drink a margarita and do great wonders for my stomach.
Ah, the bean roll, the cheapest and most filling snack in town. At the time, there were 3 press rooms in the Metro Courthouse, and one belonged to the Banner. So second week on the job, Bruce is working with Tam Gordon at the courthouse.
In walks Fate Thomas.
Now that's a name that might separate old Nashville from new. Sheriff Fate Thomas was the very definition of a Southern power broker. His annual sure-shot rabbit hunter's supper was an event where deals were done and future politicians were coronated. And just a little aside here, Fate's drawl was so thick, there was once talk in our newsroom of subtitling his sound bites. All right, back to Bruce and Fate.
And he's wearing a powder blue suit, and he's got these big cowboy boots on. But Fate didn't want to talk to Tennessean. He wanted to come in and talk to Tam. So he comes in, and I swear it's like yesterday, I can see it. He sits back in this chair, knocks his cowboy boots up, plops them up on top of Tam's terminal. And then for the next 30 minutes, he tells her everything going on in the city. Like, he's leaking like a sieve. Tam Gordon had the city wired. She had Metro so wired.
Okay, so Dobie has a million stories. Trust me, there are some greats. And we'd probably need another episode and maybe a censor to get them all in. But it really was a different time for Nashville media.
Roger Shirley's at the city desk. Roger was editing copy, and he smoked. He'd have a cigarette in his hand, and he would never just flick the ash. He would bang his whole arm against the desk, and the ash would then fall on a tray below. And then with the other hand, he would be doing this to his hair. And there were like 50 other eccentrics in the newsroom. Bob Battles over there drinking whiskey and eating 2 buttermilk biscuits and sausage with gravy every day. But, they were also bright. and they could just get it done. And these were no idiots. I mean, these were street smart, very bright Tam Gordons of the world who could walk in and watch out. They're going to find it out. They're good.
You're listening to Banner and Company. We'll be right back. If there was a heyday for the Banner, I think Bruce Dobie saw the end of it.
I got swooped into having to do a lot of stuff that the front office wanted, a lot of which was really cloudy to me ethically, like whether it was the publisher not liking this person on an individual level or had a score to settle.
And there was one story that really pushed him over the edge. It was the late 80s, and come to find the Republican candidate for governor, Winfield Dunn, hadn't paid his taxes for 2 years. Dobie got the story.
And I just wrote the lead straight up.
But that's not exactly how the lead went to print. He says the lead ended up listing how much Winfield Dunn had paid in taxes, not that he avoided paying altogether for 2 years.
I remember when I left the Capitol Hill press corps, they presented me the phone that at that moment I kicked across the Capitol Hill press room, and it just fell into a million pieces, and they collected it in a shoebox, and when I left to start the Nashville scene, they gave me this torn apart phone.
In February 1998, the Banner suddenly, shockingly shut down. The front page that day read "End of Story" in big, bold letters. It's got a photo of the staff. There's Mary Hance, Roger Shirley, Nikki Pendleton Wood holding her brand new baby. But one person was missing.
Yep. Me.
Photographer Larry McCormack. He started the same year as Bruce Dobie, 1983, and he loved every minute of it. Maybe minus the tea parties he had to photograph for Betty Banner.
I was at the first Predators game. I was at the first Titans game. I was at the first, everything that happened in Nashville, we got to be a part of. And you watched history unfold, from 2nd Avenue and Broadway changing from porn places and pawn shops into what it is today.
So that day, February 20th, 1998, the last day the paper went to print, it was a moment he didn't want to miss.
I was wondering, are we going to take a final photo? And somebody said, yeah, we are. And I said, well, who's going to take it? And so I went to the publisher and I said, who's going to take the picture? And he said, oh, we're going to get a Tennessean photographer. And I mean, that's like saying your brother's going to beat you over the head or something. I mean, this is our biggest competitor. And now at our last moment, we're going to look up at him and smile. No way. I mean, it just flew all over me. And so I said, I'd like to take the picture. And he said, well, then you won't be in it. And there wasn't really much Photoshop at that time. I couldn't just Photoshop my head in there. But I said, I really feel like we need to do this. I'd bought film myself, and I shot it with my manual camera, so it was mine. And that last picture I shot, and it's in my possession. It was just a point of pride that I wanted to make sure that it wasn't taken by somebody at the Tennessean.
It can be hard to explain the real emotion you feel when you're playing on a team. Athletes know it, and you know what? Journalists know it too. Especially if you've stayed loyal to a team for many years. Well, now I'm getting a chance to jump off the bench and be a starter at a startup operation. It's the Banner. That name is loaded with tradition, pride, and history, but this is a new Banner with an emphasis on depth, a dedication to the truth and to this community's need to know. This Banner aims to be fearless, always fair, and tireless when it comes to truth-telling. It's now my 40th year in Nashville as a journalist, which is kind of hard to believe. But I've got to say, I've never been more fired up.
This is nostalgia, and everything was always better 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I don't want to think like that, but I do think that American journalism is a point where it has lost the oomph that it used to have, and that's at democracy's peril. I hope in 5 years, some reporter calls up and goes, I'm so-and-so, and they're a 25-year-old reporter, I'm so-and-so, a reporter for the Nashville Banner, and I got some questions to ask. And I hope the person at the other end of the line goes, gulp, I got respect for you, because y'all do great work. I need to be on my toes, and I need to tell you what's up, correctly and accurately.
Banner & Company is a production of the new Nashville Banner. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. Our producers are Steve Haruch and Andrea Tudhope. Original music by Verlin Thompson. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow along at NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company.